The Clear Signal with Steve Vischer.
Well, hi everybody. Welcome back to The Clear Signal. It's great to have you with us. And this week we're going to be looking again at military tactics and strategy and the politics and the mechanisms that go around that. My very special guest this week is retired Australian Major General Mick Ryan. Mick is someone who's had a distinguished career in the Australian Army, and as you'll hear, that spans more than 30 years. And he's served in many conflict zones where Australian military have been sent over that time and has served with distinction. Now, Mick remains passionate in his post-military career about all of these topics and spends a lot of time talking tactics and strategy and trying to convince our leaders to be more prepared militarily in terms of spending and in terms of the acquisition of better technology, and also talking to the Australian public about why that's important. And as we've seen from so many conflicts that are going on around the world at the moment, and perhaps some potential ones that might be coming a little bit closer to home here in Australia, he is quite passionate about having that conversation with the Australian taxpayer about why that's important, and it very well certainly is. Mick's also an author, and some of his novels, I'm actually about halfway through one right now, talking about a potential conflict in this part of the world, which is chillingly realistic, and we had a bit of a chat about that too. It was a great pleasure to meet Mick Ryan. I certainly hope you enjoy the conversation. Mick Ryan, thanks for joining us. It's great to meet you.
Thanks. It's great to be with you, Steve.
I love talking about military stuff. Some of the things I see in the military sphere at the moment kind of worry me a bit, but they also fascinate me. I guess before we get into talking about some of that stuff, for people in our audience who might not be familiar with your career, could you take us through what I believe is a 35-year career in the Australian Defence Force?
Sure. I graduated from Duntroon, was allocated to engineers, served at a variety of command and leadership appointments all the way through to Commander of the 1st Brigade, as well as Commander of the Australian Defence College as my final appointment. Served in a bunch of staff roles, including on the Joint Staff in Washington, D.C., as well as Director General Army Strategy and other appointments here and overseas, and served in East Timor, Iraq, Afghanistan, plus a couple of stints in the United States. So, I had a great career. I love the Army. I'm still a reservist and contribute where I can. But it really gave me so many opportunities, and be very difficult to ever pay back Army for what it gave to me.
Yeah. That's a really important message these days in an era where the Australian Defence Force is sometimes, well, certainly at the moment, it's struggling to get people interested in joining the military. I think messaging like that is really key to getting out. Do you think Defence is doing the best job it can there, or do you think they can improve? That's really a positive message we need to spread.
Yeah, I don't think it's getting the message out at all. Starting with recruiting to the Australian Defence Force, no one joins the Australian Defence Force. They join the Army, Navy and Air Force. So there's pretty muddled messaging right from the very start. And, the fact that it's entirely centralised, the services don't really get much say in what's going on, is only adding to the problems, I think.
It's certainly something that's an ongoing issue. I know it gets talked about in other podcasts that I produce all the time, and how do these various branches of the service, when you think about the technology that's coming in and you're trying to attract young people at the moment, it's really an exciting time. There is so much amazing technology that's coming in. You would think that would be somewhere that they would really focus on and really try and get that out. For example, if you were wanting to join the Air Force over the last 10, 12 years, the government has really procured an entire new generation of Air Force aircraft and technology.
Yeah, you wouldn't know that by seeing the recruiting ads. The recruiting ads focused on humanitarian operations to evacuate people from floods and these kind of things. One wonders what they're thinking in these recruiting ads, but they haven't worked for a long time. They're not working at the moment. And, I think this over-centralisation of everything in defence is hurting the Army, Navy and Air Force and the Joint Force. Ironically, it seems to be the one lesson that the departments learned from the war in Ukraine is to centralise everything like the Russians had.
Yeah. Well, it all comes down to strategy, and even when you're talking about strategy on the battlefield, it's strategy in recruiting. Maybe we need to be getting a more direct message out about this is what we do, this is what you can expect to do, and particularly when we're going into some really challenging times at the moment, maybe they just need to be honest about that. If I think back to ads that were in the 1980s, for example, trying to get people to join the army, for example, they were much more along those lines, not talking so much about humanitarian. Yes, that's important, of course, but it's not really what the Defence Force is primarily about, at least not in my view.
Well, also, it should be about what you're going to do for us. It shouldn't just be all about we're going to give you this. You attract the wrong people that way. You attract takers, not givers. And at the end of the day, service in the Army, Air Force, and Navy is all about giving and serving. And unless we emphasise that, you won't get that kind of person in through the door.
You mentioned that you were in East Timor and have gone through to several other theatres, military theatres over that time. I imagine there's been step changes every time, technologically speaking, as you've gone into each of those different theatres. Has the strategy, though, at a basic level, changed at all in the way that they operate?
Basic tactical operations change like everything else, but they probably change a little more slowly depending on where you're at. Some of the core important things that armies do, whether it's train leaders, be brilliant at the basics of tactics and logistics, medical evacuation, that doesn't change at all. How you do it might change, but the importance of those functions has not changed. I think the Australian Army in particular has one of the best non-commissioned officer corps in the world. The training continuum is superb. I'd put the Army training continuum up against anything in the world. I think that importance of training, of selection, of leadership has not changed one little bit. It's just how we affect it has changed with technology and the very significant changes in Australia's strategic situation since I graduated from Duntroon in 1989.
There's always a lot of talk, particularly, I guess, around Air Force. I see this a lot. That's kind of the realm I deal with a lot, where they talk about networked environments. And I suppose when you're talking about the warfighter on the ground, the use of that technology and networking vital information back to that person who's standing there at the pointy end is really vital.
Yeah, there's two elements to this. There's the network, which is all the technical elements that connect machines and people to people. And then there's networking, which is what humans do, which is connect to each other to provide purpose, to provide direction, to provide feedback. Um, and you need to understand both. And all three services need both. And I think, as we've seen in particular in Ukraine, the network and networking has been democratized and proliferated by the Ukrainian armed forces down to every single individual. That is not something we're close to doing in the ADF at the moment, unfortunately, but it changes how commanders can operate, how visibility is gained and provided, and it changes the speed at which tactical and operational activities are undertaken.
I think Ukraine, in a macabre and tragic sort of way, it seems to me, has become a theatre-wide testing lab for a lot of new technologies. We're looking at AI and that type of stuff now. Is that the way you see it? I mean, there seems to be a lot of focus now on using more drone technology, more unmanned aerial systems more widely in that theatre. There's got to be a lot of information being gained from deploying that type of technology and bringing it back, more broadly.
Well, all wars are learning opportunities. They always have been, and the clever armies are ones that are able to learn to learn better, adapt, and improve more than their adversary can. That's been the same since the Peloponnesian War and everything between then and now. It's just that the pace of change at the moment is probably a little different. We are seeing the pace of technological change, the pace of tactical change, the pace of change in the strategic environment speed up. And I think the pace of change and the speed at which the Ukrainians are learning and adapting is incomprehensible to the bureaucrats in Canberra largely. That's why we haven't learned a lot of the lessons, because they just can't really appreciate how quickly things are moving. When Canberra is used to decades long change, the Ukrainians are used to hours and days. And we have not done a very good job of learning the lessons for Ukraine. I'm yet to see any kind of public statement or document from the Department of Defence that talks about this in any uh, significant kind of way. Um, I go there frequently and I ask this question about how they learn and how they adapt in Ukraine. And they're doing it from top to bottom of the organisation. It can be uneven at times. and they're being assisted by industry in ways that are incomprehensible in this country. The probity people in this country prevent any really meaningful interaction between soldiers and industry. But it is the only way the Ukrainians have found how to get things done. And entities such as Brave One and Come Back Alive have been critical to that. And we really need to look at those kind of entities because they supercharge innovation and learning.
Of course, all militaries, when they're going in, are instruments of government policy, which of course forces military leadership to engage with their political masters, who change obviously a lot more often than perhaps military, leadership ranks do. That must be a very frustrating thing to do when you're working in that Canberra bubble. Is it a possibility now, when we see world events evolving as quickly as they are, and the possibility, of course, that China, with their rapid military expansion, is that an opportunity now? Do you find that there's a mood in Canberra now to, improve this communication, this improvement process, and make it more efficient, more rapid?
Well, I mean, the interaction between military and government and the bureaucracy is a critical relationship. The military and government is obviously one key relationship. The military and the bureaucracy is another. Remember, civil control of the military is the government controlling the ADF, not the public service. And too many public servants don't understand that. But the third really important relationship is the military and the people of this country. So all three, I think, need to be better defined. They are somewhat codified in the Constitution, in the Defence Act, but civil military relations is a very understudied field in this country. It happens, but it's pretty well defined by the participants that go around each time rather than codified in anything more meaningful. And each person has to learn the best way to do it rather than come in with a bit of a guidebook in best practice. So I think it's important we look at this more and how do we improve the interaction between the military and government? Well, at the end of the day, this is up to government. They have to provide clear direction, obviously take advice, but they need to provide clear direction. And I don't know that the current government is up to the challenge of understanding just how quickly change is happening in the environment and just how much we need to actually invest in defence to be able to respond effectively. I'm not aware of any expert in defence and national security affairs in this country who thinks the current spending is even close to adequate. The challenges of the AUKUS submarine and its skewing of force structure and readiness already mean that the spending challenges are even more profound. It is not up to the military to make the case to the Australian people for that. It is up to the government to have an honest conversation with the people about the problems and how to solve it. And we're not seeing that at all at this point in time.
There is a big push, of course, from the US government as we record this for Australia to up its spending as a proportion of GDP. The US government is sort of pushing, 5%. I wonder if that's kind of an ambit figure that they want, and with the hope that at least we might increase it above the levels that we're at. One of the risks that I've heard expressed, certainly in the defence journalism community, is that may well be soaked up with an increase in bureaucracy. I suppose that would be the risk. If we're going to spend that extra money, we need to make sure that it's finding its way to the warfighter and in at certainly much higher levels and with better technology.
Yeah, I mean, we don't need any more bureaucrats. We need the ones we've got to just focus on the important stuff. At the end of the day, Hegseth's comments about 3 to 3.5% puts him at the end of a long line of Australian experts, including myself, who've been arguing for some time that we need to increase defence spending. I thought his comments were measured and unremarkable because he's hardly the first person to make this argument. The AUKUS submarine budget is skewing the budget and the force structure of the ADF and will only do so more and more into the future. Unless we spend more on defence, in a decade we risk having 3 second-hand nuclear submarines and 2 dogs. I mean, that it is having such a major impact on skewing force structure and budgeting in defence. We have to increase spending.
Is it sort of a question without notice, Mick, but I wonder with regard to everybody focuses on AUKUS Pillar 1, which of course is the submarines. There are other parts to it, and I've talked about that in other editions of this show. But yes, the submarine is soaking up a huge amount of money. Do you think that was the right choice? Should we have stuck with the attack class, the diesel electric boat that was slated to come before it?
Well, it's hard to know now because there's no going back to the French option. And if we cancelled the nuclear submarine now, anyone we did want to go to would basically have us over a barrel. We would not have any sound negotiating position. So we put ourselves in a terrible position with this, to be quite frank. The optimum solution probably was the Japanese Soryu class submarine, but we made a terrible hash of that politically, and just weren't able to take the Japanese on the journey of how we might collaborate in doing that. I think it would be a very different conversation these days. But the whole AUKUS program, whether it's Pillar 1 or Pillar 2, is designed to enhance our strategic deterrence. Whether it will achieve that or whether that money might have been spent to better achieve that in other ways is something we'll never know now, because there was never really any examination of the opportunity costs of the 360 billion plus that we'll spend on these submarines.
Yeah, and I think plus is the big factor there. I mean, it's very likely to blow out beyond that. My worry, and I know a lot of analysts will say the same, is that events may overtake us by the time we got our full complement of 12 boats, if we ever got that far. Whatever conflict we think we're going to be trying to use those to mitigate against will probably have passed us by.
Well, I think there's always a very strong case for submarines in Australia's force structure. I don't think anyone's saying we don't need them, and I'm certainly not. I think we do need them. But it's, what kind are the right kind? Where will they operate? I think is important. South China Sea is not the only area of operational interest for us. South Pacific, the Indian Ocean are also important. But also the balance of crewed and uncrewed underwater systems is important. I think in Australia we've been remarkably laggard in adopting uncrewed systems across all the domains, when many, many countries across the world have demonstrated a much better ability to learn the lessons of Ukraine, not just in uncrewed systems, but countering uncrewed systems, as well as meshing military and commercial sensor systems to enhance long-range strike capabilities. There's a lot more for us to learn, and there's a lot of speed to be had in that learning that we haven't yet demonstrated.
Mm. I attended the Land Forces Expo in Melbourne here last year, and what really stuck out to me was the increase, the wide array now of uncrewed systems, and we're talking land, sea, and air that are on offer from multiple manufacturers from all over the world. It really opened my eyes, I must say. Someone who normally deals in aviation only, you'd kind of expect this, but we are now seeing, land-based variants of these uncrewed systems. The question is, how do we sell that concept, not only to our politicians to take them on, but take them on in sufficient numbers for them to be a really decent deterrent force?
Well, I mean, one of the great things about this country is we have many manufacturers of these different uncrewed platforms, the systems that they carry, as well as uh, uh, counter UAS systems. All of these things are made in this country, exported to places like Ukraine and stuff, but we're just not investing enough as a government. I mean, you saw the US administration issued an executive order not long ago about manufacturing drones in America. We should do something exactly the same in Australia, and we should mandate that at least 50% of every uncrewed system that is bought by the Australian Defence Force is made in Australia. And not only that, we should mandate that Australian crewed systems should be used by bushfire brigades around the country, by police forces, and everyone else. Let's not be going to China every time we want some cheap drone. Let's develop this capability in Australia. The Ukrainians have developed from zero 3 years ago the capacity to build a dizzying array of short, medium, and long range uncrewed systems in the air, on the ground, and at sea in their millions. We may not need millions, but boy, we need a lot across both the military and the public safety sectors, and we can build a lot of them here in this country.
Earlier this week, actually, Mick, I was attending a media event at a company here that's setting up that sort of manufacturing, a drone AI manufacturer here that's setting up here. So it does give me some hope that perhaps there might be some, assuming that they're taken on, of course, and that their product is procured locally here, maybe that's the start of some sovereign capability here that, as you mentioned, we really do need to stand that up. So it does give me some hope that companies are still looking at investing here in Australia. We just need to make sure that, given, of course, they've got the right gear, that, it's taken on by the ADF and used.
Well, our soldiers, sailors, airmen, and women all want this stuff, but there's a big gap between them and those who make it, and that big gap is called Canberra.
One thing that it's interesting with all this technology that's coming on, I suppose ultimately and tragically, it always in the end in a war zone comes down to a kinetic engagement of some type. Blending in this new technology is fantastic. I suppose we have to also achieve, though, a balance between over reliance on that technology because if it's there, it can be disrupted. So I suppose that's something strategically that's always needs to be looked at. Like there must be a plan B in case we can't use that technology.
Yeah, I mean, not every problem requires an uncrewed system. Sometimes it just requires a person. Sometimes it doesn't require any technology at all. So, what we need is a wide variety of capabilities in a different kind of balanced ADF. I really despise this focus force because it's narrow and assumes we know every problem we're going to face in future. The balance force for the ADF was never about keeping the three services happy. It was always about providing the widest array of options for when we got surprised, which was pretty much at the start of every war. But the new balance force needs to be balanced between the services. It needs to be balanced between crewed and uncrewed. It needs to be balanced between expensive and exquisite systems and cheap mass small systems. And it needs to balance between humans and machines. So, I think we need to return to a balance force concept, but in a very 21st century way of balancing out things.
Well, Mick, let's take a look at some recent events that have happened around the world. Speaking of use of technology, perhaps some old and some new. Of course, as we record this, it's been a week or two now since the United States sent a fleet of B-2s into Iran to take out some nuclear installations there. I wanted to look at that from a strategic standpoint. I mean, there was a pretty interesting deception operation, for example, that seemed to take place at the start of that. The cues now, looking back, were quite obvious, it seems, sending a tanker and an air bridge of tankers across, for example. What would have prompted such a rapid course of action by the United States? Was this something they must have had some intelligence at this time? We've been hearing, of course, that Iran has been 5 minutes from a nuclear weapon probably for the last 20 years. So what was different this time?
Well, I think what the Trump administration saw was an exploitable opportunity. I mean, this is something that the US military would have been planning on for 1 or 2 decades. It's developed the technologies, it would have developed all the attack profiles and updated them as technology changed and the threat changed. But I think with the Israelis just showing how weak Iranian air defenses were and already having started the job of taking down the Iranian nuclear system, there were these targets the Israelis couldn't get at from the air and offered them to the Americans. Now, I am almost certain that the Israelis would have had a plan on the shelf to go in with a raid on the ground to attack these locations if the Americans hadn't come in. But I think Trump saw an opportunity, and he saw an opportunity for leverage to force the Iranians to negotiate in better faith than what they have in the last 20 years. So I think there was a combination of reasons for the US to come in on this. Now, you've got to be careful that, one and done, you don't get to decide you're one and done. Only the enemy can decide that. And we're yet to see whether the Iranians will respond to that B-2 raid of nearly 2 weeks ago now.
There certainly was talk by the Iranians of blocking shipping coming through the Gulf there. Yes, as we record this, that has not eventuated. And of course, the US president has been quite vocal about what he might do if that happens. Of course, the risk, of course, is that this conflict escalates more widely, and that's something that nobody wants.
Yeah, I mean, the Iranians have limited capacity to escalate compared to, say, a couple of years ago. It used to be that the Israelis didn't want to take on Iran because they'd use their proxies, Hamas and Hezbollah, to, shower Israel in rockets. Well, Israel peeled back the onion one at a time. After 7 October, it had a different strategic risk calculus. It could never allow to happen what happened again. So it took down Hamas And then it very cleverly took down Hezbollah in the north in a very different kind of conflict, which really opened the way for then taking down the Iranian nuclear capability. Now, whether it's actually achieved that for any meaningful amount of time is debatable. And the more we learn, the more it appears that it will have delayed it, but it may well have um, sent the message to the Iranians: the quicker you get the bomb, the quicker you can stop these kind of raids on you from Israel. So it might have that perverse effect as well.
The Chinese aspect, I think, of this is interesting. I read recently something about the Chinese being quite embedded with their Belt and Road Initiative within Iran, which gives them a lot of land bridges across into Europe, for example, if they ever wanted to, bring freight or something more nefarious, I suppose, across there. Do we think there's a Chinese angle to this? Would this have had anything perhaps to do with also sending a message to them to stay out of that region, or what do you think of that?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think you're going to keep the Chinese out of the Middle East, and there's no real reason to keep them out from an economic perspective. There's no doubt that Russia, Iran, China, and North Korea are aligned in their hatred of the US-led global order that's existed and benefited us in Australia immensely, indescribably since 1945, and that they are uh, sharing insights. They now comprise what I would describe as a learning and adaptation block. They are learning lessons from the war in Ukraine, from Russia, and from North Korea. They are learning lessons from Russia and Iran about sanctions evasion. They are learning lessons from North Korea and Iran about hiding weapons of mass destruction. So, this learning and adaptation block is extraordinarily dangerous. And indeed, it was covered very briefly in the US National Intelligence Community's 2025 threat update. I think we're going to see more in this interaction. It is now kind of a knowledge bazaar that's shared between these four authoritarian powers. And indeed, it's being used to develop what you could probably describe as a new arsenal of authoritarians, which we are yet to adequately respond to.
I can remember the Cold War finishing, Mick, but it seems to me like we're still in one. Just the players have changed a bit. I mean, the way you describe that there is precisely what that is, whether people want to call it that or something else.
Well, the Cold War never ended for China. I mean, Xi has made that very clear, and so has Putin. We were the only dummies who thought it was over because electoral cycles and short term thinking and economic opportunism uh, meant that, it was good for us to have it over. But the Chinese never left their competition with us, neither did the Russians. Certainly, Iran never did, and neither has North Korea. So that ideological conflict that existed throughout the Cold War still exists and endures, and it's something that we're going to be in for decades to come.
As we record this now, I'm about halfway through your novel at the moment called White Sun War, which is fascinating. I've read another book recently by another military, it's actually two authors. I can't think of the name of it, but it was very similar, centering around a future conflict in Taiwan. When we talk about the Chinese, there's a lot of talk around about if or perhaps when they will invade Taiwan. Is that something that we should be really looking at? I hear timetables of around 2027. Your book, I noticed, set in 2028. Um, I find your book, based on some of the things I see around autonomous platforms, which feature very heavily within your book, it's almost a commentary on things that are likely to come.
Well, that's why it's on the curricula of military academies overseas and on the reading lists of service chiefs in places like Canada and America. Because it was designed with a theoretical basis of war, how it changes, how it in some elements it endure. Based my first book, War Transformed. There's a lot of research in it. You don't just make stuff up. There's a lot of factual basis to this, and it's designed to be more accessible than some of the more stodgy non-fiction approaches to looking at a future conflict in the Western Pacific. So, hopefully people will enjoy it, but also learn from it. And as I put in there, hopefully it will allow them to double down on their efforts to deter such a conflict. But you have to invest in deterrence. Deterrence doesn't just happen, and that comes through increased defence spending.
Yeah, peace through strength, of course, is something that's sort of coming up a lot again lately. There's so much going on in the world in military theatres at the moment. Do you think we risk focusing too much on one at the expense of the other? I note, for example, that the Ukraine war, which has taken up a lot of media news space over the last few years, seems to be waning a little bit now. It's almost as if the media has become tired of it and wants to move on. But it certainly hasn't stopped the Russians from indiscriminately bombing in Ukraine, both military and civilian targets.
Well, that's what the Russians rely on. They rely on everyone uh, being strategically impatient and moving on. That's exactly what Putin found with his invasion of Crimea and the Donbass, and it was part of why he went in. He thought that the West would lose patience and just move on. And he has been largely right in many parts of the world, in North America and in Australia, unfortunately, but he hasn't been right in Europe, where they have doubled down on their resistance and their confrontation of the aggression shown by Putin. So he's been kind of right, but kind of wrong. We just need to make him far more wrong than we have in the last couple of years.
As we finish up here, Mick, I know time is running out on us here, but one more concept I wanted to talk to you about that you referenced in your book was the use of the US Space Force, which at its outset was kind of parodied in many circles, I find. Yours, I think, and I read widely in this techno thriller sort of genre. I have not heard any other book or read any other book yet that references the US Space Force, but the way you've woven that into the storyline makes a lot of sense. And we see now people taking the space realm, if you like, far more seriously.
Well, it is serious. I mean, without space based capability, you can't see, you can't talk, and you can't navigate. And without those three things, you can't win at war. I work with an Australian who's at Space Command on this. The book is actually on the reading list for the Space Command. I've given presentations to them about it because there aren't too many people who've looked at space-based capability, but we should be in absolutely no doubt without a robust space and potentially counter space capability. There is no 21st century military operations. There is no 21st century global commerce. There is no 21st century internet and communications. So, space is no longer some discretionary thing of a few people in the back office. It is central to everything we do in national security and maintaining national prosperity.
Very, very true. It's a really different world we live in. I find myself an old man, Mick, saying to my children who are in their late 20s now, back in my day, we didn't have the internet or we didn't have all this instantaneous. It's hard to even think back only a couple of decades when we didn't have this sort of technology, isn't it? But here we are now, and we have to make sure that, of course, the systems we have are robust and, God forbid we ever come to any sort of conflict, but we need to be prepared for it. And as you say, and I agree, we need to be better prepared for it here in Australia.
Yeah, at the end of the day, it's about an honest conversation with the Australian people about the threats, the real threats we face, and what that means for our society and what that means for resourcing a response. It is not a conversation we've seen at any great length from the government. Indeed, the National Defence Strategy, when it was released, when was it released? The night before Anzac Day, which is generally not when you release things that you're proud of and want to be seen widely in the Australian community. So, you couldn't give the government very high marks for engaging the Australian community in kind of threats we face. Indeed, when you had the Chinese People's Liberation Navy doing circle work around Australia a little while ago, the government did everything it possibly could to make sure it wasn't on the news. I mean, this is not the actions of a responsible government when it comes to national security.
That was if that wasn't a wake up call for our political class and people in the defence establishment here, I don't know what is. That was belligerent, I believe, a belligerent
It,
move, and was obviously done with great purpose. The Chinese are not stupid; they are very purposeful. They're very smart operators, and that was a message to say, we can be here anytime at any time we choose.
yeah, and it basically said we can coerce you by doing this because you can't respond, or worse, you have not demonstrated the will to respond, which I think was one of the big lessons from this government. So the Chinese have kind of found out this government. The Australian people have found out this government. I think there's much more we need to do, not just in resourcing national security, but demonstrating the will to defend this country into the future.
I think the challenge for the Australian voting public is to ensure that no matter which flavour of politician we get in, that we get good politicians. We get smart politicians who really have the national interest over and above their political interest at heart. And I think that's a challenge the world over in every democracy for sure.
It sure is.
Mick Ryan, it's been my absolute privilege to meet you. I appreciate your time today. Thanks so much for joining us.
No problem. It's great to be with you.
Get in touch. Join the conversation. Find us online at clearsignal.com.au.